I just want to say you've been sitting here and you've been listening to forecasts. And you've heard diverse forecasts, and this afternoon you're going to hear another half a dozen forecasts. And it reminds me, with all the conversations we've had, as some of you know, we have a gathering up in Maine, and that is at a lodge north of Bangor. And by the way, I think Jill Fernito, we still have 2 empty cabins, right? So anybody in this room is now invited to that gathering, which is August 3-8 in Maine, and Jill can give you the details. You got 2 empty cabins. Like an economist, we don't want to waste a resource, so you're welcome. But anyway, up there, we go to the Passamaquoddy Indian Reservation, and we fish there, and we're greeted there and welcomed there. And recently, the old chief died. Well, the tribe elected a new young chief. And he's a modern chief. He carries an iPhone, he uses the internet, he checks data. So there's a council of the elders, happens in July, and they say to the new young chief, how should we prepare for the winter? So he thinks to himself, gosh, the old chief never told me what to say in these kinds of things. So he says, I think this winter coming will be sort of normal like last winter, and we should cut and stack the wood that we need about the same as last year. So the tribe starts stacking and cutting wood, and the young chief says to himself, wait a minute, I'm a young chief. I'm technologically advanced. I don't just hold my finger up and look at the wind. So he calls the National Weather Service in Washington. Now, the National Weather Service, Chris Waller couldn't say this, but I can, uses the same mathematical formulas and computers as the Federal Reserve. Actually, they rent the basement in the Eccles building to do the math. So anyway, he calls the National Weather Service and he says, do you have a long-range forecast for winter in northern Maine? And they say, yes, we do. And he says, what is it? We do a lot of research here, they said. And he says, well, okay, tell me what it is. He says, we think the winter, this coming winter, will be about the same as last winter. He says, okay, he's feeling comfortable. Then he says to himself, what if the winter is worse? And I haven't had the tribe prepare well. So he calls the tribe together at the end of July, and he says, you know, I think the winter could be a little worse than last year. We should add a little more wood. In August, they cut more wood, stack more wood. Now he's beginning to worry. He calls the National Weather Service again. And he says, have you changed or upgraded your forecast for next winter? I said, yes. We think the next winter is going to be worse than last winter. How bad? Well, we don't know. But the current data says it's going to be worse than last year. Now he's really worried. It's September. He calls the tribe together and he says, we need to cut a lot of wood. We need to stack a lot of wood. We need to prepare for blizzard conditions. So they do it. He calls the weather forecast number back at the National Weather Service at the end of September. And he says, have you upgraded your forecast for the winter for northern Maine? And they say, yes, we have. It's going to be a horrible winter. Blizzard conditions, freezing cold. So the chief loses it. He says, you know, I've called you. What's the matter with you people? What is the source of your data to give these changes in forecasts? And he says, the Passamaquoddies are stacking wood like crazy. So we all forecast. I want to do housekeeping for 2 minutes, and then I want to introduce my friend Emily Taylor. This afternoon, we have a very unusual session. We've never had one like this before at this conference. We're going to talk about war, and we're going to talk about combat wounded veterans, their challenges. And we have 2 very special guests. We actually have 4 very special guests. So I want to introduce them for 2 minutes now, longer introduction, and their remarks are coming this afternoon. And that'll enable you to say hello at lunch. So first, Major General, retired Air Force, Scott Gray, David Scott Gray, and Jackie Gray. Scott flew Air Force One, has a distinguished military career. You can go to Safari and you can look at it. Was the commander of Andrews Air Force Base in his career, and is now the president and CEO of Combat Wounded Veterans Challenge. So Scott, stand up so everybody can see you. So Scott and I have worked together on a few things. We have some philanthropic activity going. We're working together at the university. He is involved with the Global Interdependence Center, which is thinking more broadly about a lot of things. And Jackie is with him, and they are out here in the wilds of the West and are very welcome. Other special guests, Wendy and Dom Goree. Dom Goree, distinguished naval career, 600 carrier landings, 4 trips to space as an astronaut. Previous president of Combat Wounded Veterans Challenge, neighbor of mine, so to speak, in Colorado. They're in Salida, we're in Silverthorne. And Wendy, who is with them. So Dom, let everybody see you. Wendy, thank you guys for coming. I promise you this afternoon, you will hear, and they will be true stories from these 2 gentlemen, and they won't be what you see in the movies. So that's coming late in the afternoon. Hope you can join us. Now, Emily Taylor and I have done a dozen Zooms and conferences together, and this is the first time we meet in person after 2 years of working on long COVID. So we worked on long COVID with the Global Interdependence Center, sponsored a series. That series is ongoing. We have had discussions worldwide with epidemiologists and virologists. There's some in this room who know about biotech and the research. Ed and I were talking about that earlier. And so here's what we're going to do today. Emily is going to present first. She has data. She's going to give you some numbers. She's going to describe what long COVID is. That's the first part of this. Second round is yours truly. It'll have a little policy implications, what it really means, why long COVID and several million disabled people make Chris Waller's job so much harder. And you heard it in the last 5 minutes. So without further ado, let's start with Emily Taylor.
Thank you so much. That was an incredibly kind introduction. Thank you, David. And it's been so wonderful getting to know you the past 2 years, unfortunately on a very difficult subject matter. So hi, I'm Emily Taylor. I'm the Vice President of Advocacy and Engagement for Solve-ME, an organization that's been around since 1987, focusing on post-viral illnesses, or specifically post-infection illnesses. I have the dubious achievement of being an expert in these subjects. Specifically, I'm an expert in post-viral illness known as ME/CFS, or myalgic encephalomyelitis chronic fatigue syndrome. I came to this because my mother is a patient with this disease, so I come as both a subject matter expert, as a caregiver, and of course as a policy expert as well. The reason why you didn't invite me here in 2019 is because post-viral illnesses were not very relevant in 2019. They had a pretty stagnant number, a pretty steady rate of growth and recovery, and cost the US economy about $51 billion a year. But that was stagnant. It wasn't changing, and that was sort of something we've all just become accustomed to about these people who experience this family of illnesses, kind of like cancer. It's a family of illnesses that are specific within that grouping. And we didn't talk about it much. But thanks to the pandemic and a natural experiment of a massive virus infecting a large number of people, we can now sort of determine which people get sick and stay sick, and why do they stay sick? And that's really the $64 billion question, is why are some people recovering from viruses, and why do some people become permanently disabled after getting a virus? So that brings us to, am I doing it right? Oh, the down button. Maybe. There we go. Oops, did I do too many times? Can we go back one? Thanks, guys. Oh, okay. So I go straight into what is long COVID. So what is long COVID? Long COVID is actually a patient preferred umbrella term. It's not a clinical term. There's no actual code in the ICD or the International Classification of Diseases for long COVID. We're starting to develop that now, but it's an umbrella term that represents this whole family of post-infection illnesses. In the NIH, or the National Institutes of Health, we call these terms PASC, or post-acute sequela of COVID-19. And these are an experience of individuals who have long-term symptoms or new symptoms or a reoccurrence of old symptoms. And that's important to note. And how these diseases all interact, and what are the experiences of these individuals who have these post-infection illnesses. As you see on the right of the slide, here's the numbers of what are most commonly reported among people who have long COVID. And long COVID has no real end date at this point. It's defined as people that lost longer than 3 months after their initial infection by the World Health Organization. But I've been working with patients that have literally been sick since the very first infection 2 years ago and haven't gotten better. So these patients report, 80% of these patients report fatigue. And fatigue, I know we all have long days and we all feel tired, and that's not really the kind of fatigue these patients experience. I'm talking about bone level debilitating fatigue. I can't lift my arm today because it feels like it's made of lead. I can't get out of bed today because I can't push myself upright. That's the kind of fatigue that these patients experience. 72% of these patients report experiencing what's called post-exertional malaise, or PEM. This is the hallmark symptom of myalgic encephalomyelitis. It's the unique symptom that defines the disease. And what that symptom is the experience of exerting yourself, even mildly, and then having your whole body crash and as a response. So for example, when my mother, who has ME/CFS and exhibits the symptom, she owns a small business. And for every day that she goes to her small business and does the books and takes out the trash, and she can do about 60% of a day. And then after that, between 24 and 48 hours later, all of her symptoms come back. They are exacerbated. She gets fever, swollen glands, incredible tiredness, that fatigue I was talking about, and more. So this is really just to emphasize an incredibly debilitating system for some, but it varies in a scale of mild or moderate or severe. So as I said, we've seen this before. Myalgic encephalomyelitis was recognized by the CDC in 1987 after an outbreak in Incline Village, an outbreak of mononucleosis. And a group of, they specifically studied a high school girls basketball team. And about 20% of this high school girls basketball team never recovered and ended up coming down with this mysterious illness that we now call chronic fatigue syndrome, or myalgic encephalomyelitis, or ME/CFS. This has been happening for decades before COVID hit. We're very familiar with it. And it often, the most common cause is Epstein-Barr virus, which is the virus behind mononucleosis. And this ME/CFS typically happens in about 10% of people who get mononucleosis. So we had been studying this for some time. And then ME/CFS does not come alone. As I mentioned, there's kind of that umbrella of post-viral illnesses. It often comes with forms of dysautonomia, specifically postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome, or POTS. This is an ability to regulate your blood pressure and your heart rate. So for somebody like me, if I had POTS standing here, I'd probably pass out in about 5 minutes. So POTS can be incredibly debilitating, along with fibromyalgia, which is shown to be caused by viruses. And of course, one of the beasties, mast cell activation syndrome, which is when your mast cells of your cellular system that are responsible for cleaning out your toxins stop working and are overactivated and kind of overwhelm your system. You get these honeycomb-like rashes, really debilitating. So these are sort of the family of illnesses. All of these have been found and associated with long COVID and have been found to be triggered by a COVID-19 infection. So our organization took our knowledge of ME/CFS, what we've known from the past 40 years of studying post-viral illnesses, and applied it to do a forecast of long COVID, to say, if these long COVID diseases behave like the post-viral diseases of the past, here's what we anticipate what we're looking at. And here you see on this little model, the 4 potential causes of post-viral illnesses, from autoimmune response, persistent virus, organ damage, or of course the microclots you've been hearing a lot about. The question is, which of these? Is it a combination of these? We don't really know. And that's what we're really hoping the research is going to find out for us and cure all of these millions of people. So this brings us to the white paper, which I am so pleased to have co-authored with two amazing women, Melissa Smallwood and Philippa Dunn. And we took the reported case numbers and the seroprevalence estimates of long COVID infection from the CDC and applied mathematical modeling from the knowledge of MECFS to try to estimate exactly what sort of scope we're looking at here. And I want to emphasize that we took two types of data. The first data we took is reported cases, the number of cases that have actually been reported to the CDC that we know actually took place. This is a very conservative estimate because we know that not everybody reports their cases, and we know that there's a lot of cases that got missed. So this is considered a low bar, a low number of how many people potentially could have this. We also used a secondary model, which is a seroprevalence model, in which they test random sampling among the community, find out how many people are positive, and then apply that number based on seroprevalence to the broader population. This number two tries to account for the number of unreported cases, but is also an underestimate. Seroprevalence numbers are disproportionate and they don't catch women as well. They also are disproportionate to people with autoimmune conditions. So this number, which is our high estimate, is still underreporting. And I want to emphasize that. So now we get into the actual results of the white paper. So first we have the category of people with long COVID. This is the whole number of everybody with that umbrella of illnesses, myself included. My long COVID, I would fit into this category. I had COVID about 4 months ago, and I can, as you see, function, think, do my regular day-to-day. The only time my COVID really hits me is when I get on the ice as a hockey player, which I used to do regularly. And when I got on my ice for the first shift, and I was so excited to get back after being sick, and I felt like I was breathing through a straw. I could not get oxygen to my lungs from the ice. And it just with the instant my heart rate would go up, I couldn't breathe very well. So I'm one of these people in the 22 million category, which again, that's 22 million in the total United States, about 7% of the US population, which got COVID and has some form of response, whether it mild, moderate, or severe. Now we subdivided that number to the severe cases. We define severe cases as people who are unable to work at their pre-infection levels. Now we used, again, using the myalgic encephalomyelitis numbers based on those figures, we can estimate that about 7 million Americans have already experienced some kind of disabling long COVID. That's almost 2.3% of the entire US population. Now, this third figure only comes from disability. So we're not even including the folks who missed a little bit of work or the folks who kind of bounced back. Just the folks who are disabled are going to cost the US economy $386 billion in lost productivity, increased medical costs, and lost savings. And again, this is the conservative estimate. Moving onward to the seroprevalence model, which again is the more comprehensive estimate, you see these numbers almost double. We're talking about nearly 13.5% of the US population experiencing some kind of long COVID, and almost 4.5% of the US population being disabled by their long COVID. And again, taking those disabled numbers and converting those into actual financial cost, we're talking about $511 billion of damage that's already been done to the US economy in lost savings, lost productivity, and increased medical costs. This is the scale that we are not prepared to face. Further in our white paper, we broke these numbers out by state, so we could really zero in on policy impact of which states are going to be most affected by this. And you can see this sort of reflects population. Obviously, states with larger populations are going to have more people infected, are going to have more cost. But what really gets interesting, and this model is in your paper, your handouts, so please take a look at it later, is when you start subdividing by percentage and you start looking at the case numbers and the reports of incidents by state numbers based on the CDC data. And you see that when you really break it down, those percentages get really interesting really fast. The seroprevalence model estimating almost 17% of the population in North Dakota is going to experience some kind of long COVID. Near 5.6% is potentially facing disability. I highly encourage you to look at all the full table, which has every state in the union in the long COVID white paper, which is on our website. The summary has been handed out with a QR code that you can easily get to. But just truly wanted to emphasize that these numbers, no matter how you slice them, are staggering. I'd also like to encourage you to look at the white paper for our section on labor force participation rate. We tried to put some of these numbers in context and put them as a ratio of labor force participation rate for the overall country. Now, again, these are mathematical models. We know they miss a lot of factors, like, for example, not everybody was working age. Some of those folks might have been unemployed or already retired. So those factors definitely do create some uncertainty in the mathematical models. But no matter how you slice it, the data is pretty staggering about how much this is really impacting our working population. So really, in conclusion, I just want to emphasize that long COVID, or the umbrella of diseases that we refer to as long COVID, is an urgent public health crisis. It's only developing more as people get more reinfected and the likelihood of their long COVID increases. And we are really committed to helping the millions who suffer, both through research and through advocacy. So it's been an absolute pleasure. I'm looking forward to answering your questions. And thank you so much for taking the time to really listen to this important issue.
Before I start, I want to ask Emily two questions. I just told her I'll ask her one, but I want to ask her two. First of all, when was the research paper released? I remember doing it as part of that system, but I don't remember when it was done.
The paper was published in April.
In
The data was through January 31st of 2022. So all of that data is from the beginning of the pandemic to January 31st.
And it didn't get any better.
No, it's only getting worse.
Second thing is, you were involved in the briefing for Congress and the issue of this bill of national health research and support, which is being held up in a political fight, like everything else in the United States. Would you give 1 minute about that and 1 minute about where that stands in the House and Senate?
Absolutely. I was so privileged to work with some amazing Senate and House offices to introduce several packages of legislation. Two in particular are the Care for Long COVID Act and the Treat Long COVID Act, sponsored by Senators Kane, Duckworth, and Markey in the Senate, and Representatives Jack Bergman and Don Beyer in the House. These two bills together would both create centers of excellence and fund at $2 million a year comprehensive centers of excellence for long COVID throughout the country. I didn't get a chance to talk about how service deserts are a real problem. A lot of people in urban areas have access.
Take a minute and talk about it.
Oh, yes. A lot of people in urban areas have access to post-COVID care or post-viral specialists, but in many areas, especially rural areas, those services are simply not available. There's no specialists. So especially funding treatment centers in rural areas would be absolutely pivotal. And the second piece that the bill does is it creates a national registry to document and consolidate all of the long COVID patients so that we can get clinical trials and treatments up faster. Right now, because long COVID patients are scattered to the 9 winds, there's no straight definition. Everybody's got different diagnostic codes. It's impossible to really recruit for a clinical trial, or way too expensive. So in order to expedite research, we need a registry to make sure that clinical trials can recruit easily, effectively, and quickly.
And lastly, the bill has bipartisan.
The bill has
support.
bipartisan
Please
support.
tell them.
Yes, absolutely. There are a bunch. There are about 12 different bills that have long COVID somewhere in them, but these two bills are the only ones that actually have a Republican sponsor because they consider data privacy, they consider fiscal accountability, and they truly are an effort that came from both sides of the aisle.
So the problem we have is getting the attention of America to take this seriously?
Absolutely.
Okay. And with that, I want to introduce a famous American. Does anybody recognize him? If you're sure, please raise your hand. Call it out. Will Rogers. Famous American, Will Rogers. And he died in 1935 in a plane crash. And he was a cowboy. And he was quintessentially American, for those who don't know. He was born Cherokee. His parents were Cherokee. And he has a distinguished commentary with humor about America and American politics. And so we'll start this presentation with some wisdom from Will Rogers. He said, there are three kinds of men. Now, in those days, he wouldn't have phrased it more gender neutral, but I think the intention was clear, although it may be directed more at men. The one that learns by reading. And for the last 2 years in the long COVID initiative project with the Global Interdependence Center and Solve ME and the long COVID initiative, we have been assembling and reading every single research paper and connection in the world. That's not an exaggeration. I got an email 3 days ago from somebody in Canada. They said, we have a person in our family has long COVID, and I've been reading the stuff you guys are putting out. Is there a long COVID facility in Ottawa? And we were back, Emily was back with an entire outline to assist where to go, what to do, and how to do it. That happens daily, growing numbers. The ones that learn by reading. The few who learn by observation. And the rest of them have to pee on the electric fence for themselves. Will Rogers. There's the electric fence. We're up against time, so the slideshow and the presentation will be contracted. There's a bibliography at the end of these slides in the world of disinformation, misinformation, and deception by people who use disinformation to corrupt opinions so they can subscribe you to their email list or sell you snake oil. We publish the citations for every single reference. Now, you don't have to agree with them, but you get to see them. Where'd you get that? It's not an opinion. If it's an opinion, we'll say so. I'll say so. If it's cited and it's sourced, you'll see the source. So at the end of the slideshow, which is public and available for everybody, and Emily's as well, all citations are public, and these can be used any way you want. Take long COVID seriously. The General Accountability Office of the United States published a paper in March, and they have a range of long COVID, and they have a lot of information. They use data through December 31st, if I remember correctly. And they come up with a range somewhere on the low side between 7 and 8 million Americans, somewhere on the high side around 22, 23 million Americans, and they break down the details and they break down the type of long COVID and where the implications are. We don't have enough time. Originally it was planned. The study is available. It is public. The citation is at the end, and you're welcome to look at it. There was a discussion about the science behind this, because we're into an area which is incomplete in information. And that's always a fertile ground for lots of opinions and forecasts. And we know the difficulty with those. So GAO study, I would encourage a look at it. A very detailed study was done by the NIH. It's the first of its kind that I know about. And it was able to observe and do autopsies on 44 long COVID victims who died. Took a year to do this. And it took family permissions and donations to permit it of the body. And you can think about all the things you have to get through to do this. If you have an hour, and if you have any doubts about the depth of invasion of this disease in its various forms, from the tip of your toes to the inner reaches of your brain, spend 1 hour. It is difficult. Some of it is technical. But the result is the autopsy showed that while this may be respiratory when you get it, it's a blood disease. It's a neurological disease. It creates cognitive dysfunction. It affects every organ in the body, and it's not being taken seriously. We want it to be over, but it isn't over. I would strongly, strongly recommend at least listen to it when you go for a walk. There's a lot of data to support what I just said. We'll go by it because of time. What I'd like to do is show an 8-minute video and deal with the cognitive issue.
Inflammation in the brain can cause dysregulation of a number of different cell types and have lasting consequences to cognitive function. Understanding that, when the pandemic struck and we saw how profoundly immunogenic, how profoundly inflammatory, even relatively mild cases of COVID could be, I really worried about a neurological health crisis. And I think we're watching that unfold right now. The rates of persistent cognitive symptoms in people who have recovered from COVID is frankly alarming. We need to understand how to intervene and offer effective therapy, or there are going to be just millions of people suffering with these persistent cognitive symptoms. I'm not an epidemiologist. I'm not a virologist. I'm a neurologist, but I am alarmed by the neurological possible consequences of this pandemic, and alarmed by the neurological disease that's already evident in many, many, many survivors of COVID. Even from early in the pandemic, it was very clear to neurologists that COVID infection results in a remarkably high rate of persistent neurological symptoms, including quite a high rate of persistent cognitive symptoms that includes things like difficulty paying attention, difficulty with the speed of information processing, difficulty with concentration and memory. And that is something that we should all be paying a lot of attention to. That is really, really concerning. It's debilitating. People are just not returning to their previous level of function. And that's a major problem with 265 million people worldwide infected with COVID, and some estimates of as many as 1 in 4 people, at least prior to the time of vaccination, experiencing these cognitive symptoms. This is a neurological health crisis. I'm a neuro-oncologist, and one of my clinical specialties is to take care of people following cancer therapy who have persistent brain fog, cognitive impairment as a result of their cancer and its therapy. And this so-called chemo brain or chemo fog is very similar to what people are describing after COVID. And so this so-called COVID fog shares almost the identical symptoms. And what we're finding in the laboratory is that the two types of brain fog also share a lot of the very same cellular changes that we think are underpinning this sort of fogginess. We know that with severe COVID infection that many things can go wrong, that severe disease is associated with blood clots that can cause stroke, with even direct infection of the brain, and with the consequences of multi-organ disease and damage. But even after mild COVID, people were reporting persistent cognitive trouble. And I wondered whether the inflammatory response just to the respiratory infection might be enough to trigger neuroinflammation, inflammation in the brain, and consequently dysregulate these cells that are so important to keep in balance for healthy cognitive function. What we discovered in the laboratory in mice that have relatively mild respiratory COVID, and then in human samples, COVID elicits such a profound inflammatory response in the brain. And as a result of that, brain cells that need to work together in order to communicate and function normally were dysregulated. In severe cases of COVID, there can be direct infection of the brain, but in many cases, there's no evidence of virus in the brain. What's happening to affect the brain instead is a consequence of the immune response to the virus. And what we studied was how the immune response to infection that was limited to the respiratory system could cause inflammation in the brain through signaling molecules that go from the lung through the blood and to the brain. We found pretty high levels of inflammatory molecules called cytokines and chemokines in the central nervous system just from mild respiratory infection. And together with that, we saw inflammation in a particular kind of brain immune cell, which is called a microglia. When microglia and astrocytes become reactive, they then can cause dysregulation of another kind of glial cell that form the insulation around axons, quite literally like the insulation on a wire. When that happens, the neurons, the communicating cells in the brain, can't communicate with each other in their normal way, not as quickly and not as well. And so that can cause dysregulation of the whole circuit and cause cognitive impairment. This pathophysiology is particularly prominent in COVID. Now a lot more kids are becoming infected with COVID. And so one of the next things we'd like to explore in the laboratory is to understand how early life exposure to even mild respiratory COVID might influence both brain development, brain plasticity, and cognition. As a parent, as somebody who takes care of children in the clinic, after COVID exposure, I'm very attentive to how school is going, to whether they're complaining about not being able to remember things, if they're having difficulty finding their words to describe certain things in conversations, their overall level of fatigue. I think there's many things to pay attention to as a parent, as a teacher, as a physician. It's not clear what neurological diseases people may be at increased risk for down the road. And so it's of some real urgency to understand that, to understand these neurobiological underpinnings of this initial response to COVID, to know what people may be more susceptible to, and to reset these cells to a more normal state. The risk of long-term neurological disease really gives me pause and makes me not at all ready to decrease mitigation efforts. I still feel that we need to be vigilant. We need to not fatigue of these measures, as difficult as they are. We need to really maximize vaccination and hope to minimize the long-term damage that this pandemic is going to do for generations. I think the lessons from chemobrain are really encouraging because the biology that we uncovered in the context of cognitive impairment are all potentially reversible. And that's really hopeful. In more severe cases of COVID, particularly when there are clots and strokes and direct brain infection, irreversible damage can happen. But in these more mild, acute COVID cases, this is all potentially recoverable. It's of real urgency to understand the neurobiology, to understand the basic underpinning of what is going wrong so that we can develop therapies to intervene and restore normal balance in the brain. Otherwise, I think that there will be really profound long-term consequences of this pandemic on neurological health.
Thank you. We talked about employment, missing workers. That's a fresh slide. Where's that gap? How many people are getting disabled? How's it evidencing itself? Roughly a third of those with long COVID disability are in labor force age. Think of it as 16 to 65, although some of us work beyond the age of 65. We've begun to see the uptick in disabilities. Now, we talked about how difficult it is to forecast, but the evidence would suggest you could draw the inference that this line is headed a lot higher. Governor Waller and other speakers today talked about the issue of the labor force. If you go look at the latest data from BLS, at the over 65 cohort that are working, I'm one of those. There's 800,000 fewer over 65s working today than before COVID. Ask yourself why. The handouts, which I will not have time to get into, and you can see the effect on businesses. Holly spoke about this is from your latest NFIB, what, 2-3 days ago? Okay. It shows the concern of independent businesses. We had 1 minute about kids. And in the handouts, you will see how the United States ranks against other countries. The metric there is deaths, COVID deaths, excess deaths. And you will then see how the 50 states do with deaths and excess deaths. And then you will see the different estimates from Emily's work on long COVID and serious long COVID. I want to make a point. When you look at the list of the 50 states and where they are in excess deaths, projected disability, serious disability, either method, some of those states, and I purposely put on this slide from Pew Research, the 2018 political breakdown of those states. So when someone says, this is a Republican thing, they're the problem, it's not true. Someone else says it's the Democrats' fault. It's not true. Both speakers are guilty of murder. Listen to me carefully. Both speakers are busy doing this instead of addressing the problem. When you look at the states, and I have not published this, but there is now available data by county, all 3,000 counties in the United States. I have that data. And we're working on doing it by zip code. It's not necessarily Republican or Democrat. We don't have a national system. We don't have a national database. So we have 50 different systems. One of the great states with the lowest per capita death rate, excess deaths from COVID, is Utah. The data's there. You can see the numbers in the charts. Now, we can talk about why Utah. I do business in Utah. I have friends in Utah. I have clients in Utah. I visit Utah. Something in the culture in Utah says we need to follow Paul Ryan's wisdom about the compact we have. And if you remember, he had 3 elements in it. And one of them was public health. Scott's my neighbor. He falls down. I see him from my deck. I go over and I say, hey, Scott, are you all right? Do you need help? And he does the same for me. And then we go home. There's a reason that culture is in Utah and in other places in the West. I love the West. The worst state per capita death rate in the United States is my home state of Florida. The chances of me dying of COVID in Florida were 50% higher than in Utah. And the politics in both states are the same political party. That's wrong. We're losing people. We're killing each other. And we're killing our kids. My state of Florida is the only state out of 50 that rejected vaccination options for children. Look at the data. 49, Utah included, South Dakota, Wyoming said, we'll take an allocation of vaccine for children and we'll let parents decide what they want to do. One state didn't. If you think I'm a little upset about this, you're right. We don't have good data on kids in the US, but we do have a source, and it's the UK, which has 1/5 the population of the United States. So we go to their database in which everybody who's sick for any reason gets into a national healthcare system, and we look at their data and we multiply it times 5. And we have an estimate. We draw an inference about America. There's the data. Remember, all the citations are at the end of this publication. Who gets long COVID? So what we're finding out is if you're fully vaccinated, if you're triple vaccinated, no matter which variant you got, 7, 8, 9%. Differences, but not big differences. The unvaccinated, unboosted population has one study, double the chance of long COVID. Another study, 30% increased chances of long COVID. We're learning about this. The whole question is, why do we even play this roulette? Look at the risk versus the risk. Now, vaccines are not perfect. I have written about and studied about vaccines for 50 years, all my adult life. They're not perfect. But what are the choices? I'm not going to tell anybody how to make a choice. I'm just going to present evidence. And I'm really worried about kids. And I'm really, really worried, as is every educator and hospital and medical facility in Florida, because we now have exposure to 30 or 40,000 kids that we won't be able to protect because of a political decision. It's wrong. Okay. The Federal Reserve, in its history, didn't deal with the Spanish flu pandemic. There is no evidence in the minutes of the early Federal Reserve meetings at the time of World War I with discussion about the Spanish flu. There was no mention of it. I've read the minutes. There's great resources on the minutes. You can read the entire history of the Federal Reserve in St. Louis and the New York Fed and everywhere else. There's no mention. Benjamin Strong has meetings. There's discussion. There's a record. They don't mention this disease. In the Asian flu time, when Eisenhower was president, in the records, there's no mention of the disease. There is a mention in the New York Fed about disability cases and impacts on banks. And the New York Fed in those days, back at the early stages of the Federal Reserve, divided how they would help the federally chartered banks, but not the state chartered banks. So they opened the discount window and changed the rule 100 years ago because of the notion there are people disabled more than we expect. Along comes COVID, and along comes the last 20, 25 years of research in the Federal Reserve. And the Federal Reserve said, wait a minute, this is a big issue. And SARS in 2003 ratcheted up the research. This paper was published in June of 2020. It is a marvelous piece of work. Don't worry about the math. Ignore the math. Read the summary in the English. Need help from the math, we'll get you the help. But what did it say? It analyzed 19 pandemics defined in the paper over the last 800 years. It analyzed them with the Bank of England database and what information the Federal Reserve had on the US. So it's limited, but it's pretty deep. And it talked about pandemics, and it talked about deaths, and it talked about policies. And it's a monumental piece of work. It's triggered me writing a new book, which will cover that and history that's not covered in that paper. What did it say? It said, when you have a pandemic, people die. You reallocate capital. The remaining people acquire the wealth. They feel more wealthier. The individual wealth effect goes up. The inflation rate goes up. There's fewer people. There's an entire shock underway. We've talked about that shock. We're going to talk more about it later today. Chris Waller and his colleagues have to deal now with shocks. That's not the business they would like to be in. And they have to deal with a dilemma with the inflation fight when the society has millions of people who want to get back to work and want to rehabilitate themselves. So he's got a Hobson's choice in making policy along with his colleagues at other central banks around the world. Impossible task. I applaud your courage. Those are the 19 pandemics. The paper citation is there. It's publicly available. Anybody can get it. Here's where we are. Some people say, well, this is a black swan event. There's nothing we can do. That's the Great Barrington Declaration, folks. They're condemning people to sickness and death. Maybe it is a black swan event, but that research paper and the rest of the history in our research for the book, I'm in my second draft, we looked at 300 epidemics in the history, recorded history of man. You have the first citation in the handout, which was originally in Latin. It's from the year 165. It's a great Roman oration by Aristides, and it was done in 165. What happened in Rome? That was the time of the outbreak of the first big plague in Rome. 15 years later, the golden period of Rome was over. This orator didn't die. He lived, and the records say he was disabled. He never had his strength. In the Greek history and before that, there are no records of disability, only deaths, lots of them. That's the first one I could find in antiquity, and they have repeated ever since, including today. It's not a black swan, in my opinion. Now, what are we going to do? We have a flood. What are we going to do? I won't tell you which flood and which state this photograph was taken. We'll leave that for the future. The warning. There's all the notes, all the citations. It's time for lunch. Please ask questions, welcome our guests. We hope to see you this afternoon. If this was at least provocative, I want to thank Scott Keller and Justin Hyde and Cody Hyde for permission to put this issue into this agenda. Last year was the first time, and those who are here, I made a forecast. If you remember, I said, this is going against us. We're not doing it right. We're failing as a nation in public health. And I said, we're going to have 1 million dead people. And a lot of folks were very unhappy with me. I got a lot of pushback because it wasn't an uplifting, pleasant conversation. Well, it's a year later. Scott, you permitted me to come back, and I'm still standing. Ladies and gentlemen, we have millions of our neighbors in trouble. And we're failing at public health. And if we don't do something, then it'll get worse. The forecast, if we don't do something, is another 300,000 dead by the time this meeting happens again next year. And here's the ratio. This is back of the envelope. About 300 people a day die of COVID after being hospitalized in the United States. 300 a day. Now, last night in the roundtable, I said, what would we do as Americans if a plane went down today and 300 people died? We'd say, oh, it's a crash. They do happen. The next day, plane somewhere else goes down. 300 people die. We said, oh, I don't like this. Third day, 300 people die. Fourth day, another plane. What do you think we would do in this room? What do you think we would do with our politicians and our governance and our personal choices? We have 300 people dying every single day of this disease, most of them not fully protected now. For every one that dies, multiply that number times 12. And that 12 is going to end up, and if I'm wrong, it's 14 or 13 or 11 or who knows, is going to be in the database on long COVID for everyone that dies. That's where we are. Scott, thank you for letting me come back. Cody, Justin, if you can hear me. And it's a sobering time, and let's go have lunch and talk about it.